Hello everyone, welcome back. Today we are on Lesson 19, Chapter 19, which is all about understanding dynamic websites and HTML5 applications. We're going to be talking about how to conceptualize different types of dynamic content. We're going to talk about how to include JavaScript in our HTML. We're going to talk about how to display randomized text with JavaScript, how to change images by using JavaScript and user events, and how to begin thinking ahead to putting all the pieces together to create HTML5 applications. The first thing we want to understand is different types of scripting. There is client-side and server-side scripting. Server-side is scripts that run on the web server that then send results back to your browser. If you ever submitted a form at a website, then you've experienced the results of a server-side script. Some popular server-side languages are Perl, PHP, Python, and Ruby. And then on the other hand, we have client-side scripting. Client-side runs within your web browser and there's no interaction with the web server. Everything we've done so far with JavaScript is client-side. The most popular scripting language for client-side is JavaScript. And the rest of this lesson and the rest of this course, we're going to assume the use of JavaScript for client-side scripting. Everything we do throughout this course in these lessons will be all client-side stuff. We won't be working with the server side. So let's talk about how to include JavaScript in our HTML. You can do it in one of two places. One, you can have your JavaScript in its own file with a .js extension, or you can put the JavaScript directly in your HTML files. When you put JavaScript in an external file, you reference it in script tags up top in the head, kind of like you link to your external CSS file. Your book talks about some best practices on where to place your script tags if you're putting it in your HTML. Then it goes through and shows you an example of using JavaScript to print some text on the page, and it uses the document.write. And then talks about displaying random content. You can use JavaScript to display something differently each time a page loads. Say you have a collection of text, random quotes, a bunch of images, and every time the user visits, you want to display a different image or different text. For example, if you're a religious organization and want to do a random Bible quote, or if you're a photographer and you have a bunch of your images from your portfolio, and every time a user loads the page, you want to display a different random image on top. You can do this with JavaScript. So to create a page with a quote that changes each time the page loads, you must first gather all of your quotes along with all their sources. Then you place these quotes into a JavaScript array. An array is a special type of storage unit in a programming language, and this is handy for holding lists of items. After all those quotes are loaded into an array, JavaScript is used to pick out a quote randomly, which we're going to explain in a little bit how that's done. And then we've already seen how we can print the output of that to our HTML page. In the previous example that I talked about printing text out on the page with JavaScript. We can just put all that together. The book shows you an example in Chapter 19 on how to display random quotes on your page. And it puts all of this in a function called getQuote. It talks about how to make the arrays. It shows you how to declare the arrays and add the text in quotes as each item or element in the array. And then it talks about how to pick a random number using the math.random. Math.random is an extremely useful built-in JavaScript function. And you'll find as we continue these lessons that you will use it periodically. After that, the rest of the code should look fairly similar. What we learned earlier was how to use the document.write to write HTML that the browser will then render. And then in the HTML, you call the function in between script tags. So check that example out. I'll go over that example again with you when I share my screen. That's a really good one to understand how to display random things on your page. And you can apply this to images, quotes, anything you want to display randomly. Next, we're going to talk about the document object model, or the DOM. The DOM is an invisible structure of all documents. It's not the HTML structure or the way in which you apply semantic formatting, but a sort of overall framework or a container. It's not really a tangible object to understand until you really begin to use it and interact with it. The overall container object is called the document, and any container that you create within the document to which you're given an ID can be referenced by that ID. For example, if you have a div with the ID wrapper, then in the DOM that element is referenced with document.wrapper. And then you can change the visibility using document.wrapper.style.background color. So the DOM is a framework to refer to elements and their associated objects. This is a brief example of something that's actually fairly complicated, but it will help you begin to get an idea of how to grasp working with the DOM. And then we're going to talk about unobtrusive JavaScript. Unobtrusive JavaScript is an approach to writing JavaScript. You don't need to use it to create interactive web pages, but best practices recommend that you at least consider it. There are 4 general rules to unobtrusive JavaScript. It should be usable, it should be easily degradable, it should be made accessible, and keep it separate from structure and style. JavaScript should be maintained as separate files from the HTML and CSS. So you can use the DOM to make your script unobtrusive, and then other example in your book will tell you how to transform the code that you use to generate a random quote and make it unobtrusive. So coming up next, I'm going to share my screen with you, and I'm going to show you some of these examples that we talked about on generating a random quote on your page, turning that code into making it unobtrusive, and showing you how to use JavaScript to print text on the page. Here's an example of using JavaScript to print text. So notice we have a h1 tag that says JavaScript example and a paragraph tag that says this text is HTML. So that's this up here and this text right here. That's what we learned so far on how to print text to the page. In here, in the script tags, we're going to use document.write, and we're writing to the document. Notice how we have to put the HTML tags in the single quotes. This text comes from JavaScript, which is this text right here. That's coming from JavaScript. And then this is HTML again. This is a simple way to use JavaScript to print text to your page. Another example in your book talks about generating a random quote. If you watch your corresponding JavaScript videos, it will help understand this a little bit. Here we have our function getQuote, which is the main function. We create our arrays. We have an array of quotes and an array of sources. Then we initialize these arrays with quotes. So we have this quote with the source, another quote. So now we have a quote at position 0, which is this. Another quote at position 1 of the quotes array with this. Another quote at position 2 and this. Another quote. So there's 4 quotes in the quotes array. And there's also 4 sources in the sources array. Then we get a random index into the arrays using the math.random. Then we write out the quote as HTML. Document.write is used to write HTML that the browser then renders. So document.write, notice we have to put the HTML tags. It's setting the background color. And do a document.write quotes and then I, which gives us that I equals math.floor, math.random times quotes.length. There's 0, 1, 2, or 3. And then does the same thing to get the source. Source is I, which is a random, which is either 0, 1, 2, or 3. And then our HTML here. This is how the function is called. Wherever that function call is made is where the output of the function will be placed. In this example, the output displays below a paragraph that introduces the quotation. This is not the best way to write JavaScript, as it is obtrusive and places behavior and interactivity within the HTML document itself. So notice how in our script tags, we have this function getQuote, and all this is in there. That's the function. And then in our HTML, in our script tags, we call this function getQuote. So let's see what it looks like. When we load, make it a little bigger. If we load the page again, load it again, we get another one. So we get random quotes every time we load it. Another way to do this is unobtrusively. We can use the DOM to make a script unobtrusive. To make this quotable quotes page unobtrusive, we need to make a few changes. First change we need to do is add an HTML element in the document where the quote will be placed, which is block quote, and give it an ID of quote right here. Because the block quote element has an ID, which is quote, it can be referenced in the JavaScript. Then we need to update the contents of the tag with the JavaScript inner HTML property. So block quote dot inner HTML equals quotes I. So this writes the quote to the DOM. Block quote dot inner HTML equals quotes I. The last thing we need to do is either move the script to an external JavaScript file or place it as the last HTML element on the page before the closing body, which is all right here before the closing body tag. Doing this removes the script from the HTML. So right here is an unobtrusive way to do the quotes. We have our HTML here, paragraph, using this block quote. This is for the source, and our script and our function getQuote right here. Right after this function, we call getQuote. So we're separating the HTML and the script. We do the same thing here. We create the arrays, get the element to write to by their ID. We initialize the arrays with quotes, all the same as before, and we get a random index into the arrays. And this is the different part. We're writing the quote to the DOM right here. So let's see how this works. Now this isn't styled, there's no CSS, but it works the same way. Every time I load it, we get a random quote. I want to show you another thing you can do. It's not part of your book, but this thing is called a silly story generator. If you search it online, you can find a bunch of different examples, or you can make your own. It's the same thing. We're using arrays to generate random silly stories. But like this one, this is just picking a random quote, whether 1, 2, 3, or 4. So every time we load, it's getting one of these 4 quotes. So what we're doing here, this is a silly story generator. We're making a bunch of different texts fit together to make a story. So notice we have these group of holidays, right? 4th of July, Christmas, Halloween. And we have different words: special, fun, crazy, walk, drive, run, different names. So I'll show you how this will work in a second. This is silly story generator. If I put Brad, generate story, it'll say, it was Halloween, very fun holiday, blah, blah, blah. So all these are random things. So this is a random one. 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 This is the name that's entered here. This is a random one. So I'll show you how this is done. We have our basic story text. It was blank. You see this. So the user sees a random generated one of these. A very, insert V, either special, fun, or crazy, holiday. So insert X would be one of these 3. And every time you load, it generates, it was a random one. So if we generate, every time it would be different. So essentially, it's doing the same things as the last one. It's just adding a little more complexity to it. We have our variable and function definitions. We get a random value from the array. These are all our text strings. So we have different possibilities that can be inserted into the story. And this is our story text string where it adds it all together. You can see here's our event listener and partial function definition. So the result of this, say, random value from array. It picks a random one here. It's a random one here. And then that new story equals new story, which is, it replaces it in the story text. So we say new story equals story text. New story equals new story dot replace. So it's going to replace this one with a new item. So if you look at this, it's here. Insert U. It's here. And every time it loads, it just replaces all of them. And when you click that event listener, that generate random story button, we'll show you a new random story. This is a little bit, which is this right here, the class randomize. Just a little bit extra thing of what you can do. I don't expect you guys to know or learn all this at this point. Okay, well, I hope those examples helped. Work through them, try them on your own. Like I always say, try to change them up a little bit, make them your own, and see what you can do. Coming up next, we have our Lesson 19 PowerPoint presentation, so stay tuned.